Okay, so we're going to start our question and answer, and we'll start right here in this mic.
Hi,
Go
I
ahead.
have a question about the austerity agenda. It seems to me that elite groups which haven't been targeted before are now being targeted, like the major media are experiencing a lot of cuts. Scientific organizations, by changes to National Science Foundation, funding structures are being attacked, as well as major archival organizations, like in Canada, our Archives and Library of Canada is being dismantled. What is the motivation behind dismantling these classic institutions and also institutions of propaganda?
I mean, the consequences of the austerity agenda are pretty obvious. They're in Europe, where they're being imposed more strictly, they're devastating the societies. You know, these are rich societies. They're increasing debt as anticipated. They're creating a huge number of unemployed. In the United States, which is in this case more progressive than Europe, they're being applied, but less rigorously, and they're having a milder version of the same effects. It's not because people want it. So like in the United States, for example, where there's plenty of polls, the general population considers the main problem to be unemployment, not deficit. And they're right. In fact, the deficit's probably a good idea right now. It's a stimulus to the economy, and it's a way to create more jobs. Even the IMF is coming around to accept this. So who wants austerity? Well, bankers, rich people, the people who run the world. They want austerity. One reason is, they're concerned, they're lenders, so they're concerned that maybe somewhere down the road, invisible now, there might be inflation, which is bad for people who lend and good for people who borrow, so they don't want to take that chance. The other is that the austerity programs have the nice effect of dismantling the hated welfare state. And that's bipartisan in the United States. Obama's talking about it too. You gotta go after the poor. In fact, take my getting here today. Okay, I flew. Well, there's one part, this sequestration, which is about the deficit, not unemployment, the big problem. It's got a kind of a nuanced character to it. It leaves out rich people. So one of the things that's excluded from the, by congressional decision, from the sequester is air flying. You've got to have enough flight controllers so that rich people don't have to wait a little bit when the plane comes. On the other hand, poor people who, let's say, whose kids are being thrown at Head Start and who can't get Medicaid, well, minor problem. So it's adjusted, the sequester. And you know who flies. It's not the general population. It's privileged people overwhelmingly. And that's typical. That's the way the country works. And it's the way the public sees things. So there's recent studies came out by good political scientist Ben Page and Larry Bartels, in which they just studied attitudes towards deficit, austerity, and jobs ranked by income level. And it's exactly as you'd predict. The very top of the income scale, the problem is deficits, so we have to have austerity. The rest of the population doesn't agree. And we don't have a functioning democracy. We live in a plutocracy. About roughly 70% of the population, lower 70%, their views have no influence on policy. They're disenfranchised. And you get more influence as you go up the scale. At the very top, that means, 1/10 of 1%, basically get what you want. Well, what they want is, they don't care if kids don't have schools or, don't get Medicaid or don't have Head Start. They want to make profit. And they want to get rid of this annoying welfare state. And it's even said, Mario Draghi is the head of the European Central Bank, and has been one of the more forthcoming about trying to do something about the crisis. He had an interview with the Wall Street Journal in which he told the journal that he said the European social contract is dead. Social contract means, the welfare state, one of Europe's great contributions to civilization in the past years. They can now kind of dismantle it. He didn't say he wanted that, he just said that's what's happening. And yeah, that's what's happening.
Good evening, Professor Chomsky. A lot of what you described, unfortunately, sounds like children playing with very dangerous toys, and a lot of it has to do with power. But I'm curious what you think about the role of psychological effects in all this. In particular, for example, when it comes to the environmental crisis, what do you think about what many psychologists call the what the hell effect, this conflict between the present and the future, in which people who hear such bad news about the environment, as we often hear from scientists, just say, what the hell, in the present, I'm not gonna forfeit all the enjoyment I'm gaining from all this corporate activity just to possibly make the future a little better in a way that will be completely insignificant on a collective level.
Well, that's a kind of an interesting question. Let me say again that the American population overwhelmingly wants to take strong measures to deal with the crisis. I mean, not everyone, of course. There are sectors of the Republican base. The Republicans kind of stopped any pretense of being a normal political party decades ago. They're now a lockstep service to the rich and powerful. And it's a very strange phenomenon, unusual in parliamentary systems. And you can't get votes that way. So they've had to mobilize a different base. And that includes nativists who are terrified that the UN's going to come, so we have to have guns. It includes evangelical Christians, who are a huge population in the United States, way off. The U.S. is way off the international spectrum, and religious belief always has been back to the 17th century. So that's the base. And that base either doesn't care, and why should they? Because if there's a crisis, well, all the saved souls will go to heaven, or else just doesn't believe it. You saw that in the primaries, very strikingly. The base had a voice in the primaries, and every time they put somebody forward, the Republican establishment, which was terrified, had to start a huge campaign, tons of money, to knock them back down. Bachman, Kane, Santorum, one after the other. And these people, almost all of them deny it. I think Bachman was the one who said, well, if there is global warming, it's God's punishment for homosexuality, so it takes care of that. One of them said that. And if you take a look at the Republican House, incidentally, remember the Republican House is a minority house. The majority of people are Republicans, the majority of the votes went to Democrats. But the system is so perverse and skewed that even that part doesn't work. But they're in control of the House, and it's interesting to look at what they do. So, for example, the House has 3 committees concerned with energy, and so there's 3 chairs. They're all climate change deniers. 2 of them work for the fossil fuel industry. They're just in the pocket of the corporate sector, and their only policy is to prevent anything from happening. So that's called the dysfunction in Washington. So so going back to your question, what do people think about this? I mean, people who recognize that what we're doing for our own gratification is having a serious impact on our grandchildren, maybe a devastating impact. Well, as far as I know, it hasn't really been studied, but I think you can imagine. I suppose that's why most people think we ought to do something about it. Now, what about the ALEC, the guys who are running these programs, or the the corporate campaign to convince people that there's no global warming. It'd be interesting to study them too with a psychological effect. My guess is, if you studied them, you would find that these people are very much like us. They probably contribute to the Sierra Club. You know, they're worried about global warming. They don't want their grandchildren to be underwater and so on and so forth. But that's in their personal lives. What about in their institutional lives? Well, in your institutional lives, you have to operate within the structure of the institutions. Otherwise, you're out. If you have a kind of a semi-market society like ours and you're a participant in it, you have to pursue Adam Smith's vile maxim. Otherwise, you're kicked out. You have to try to maximize short-term profit and market share. And if that has what's called an externality in economics, which gets a footnote, when you're pursuing your own self-interest in a market transaction, it has effects on others, externality, footnotes. In this case, the externality is destruction of the species, but market interactions don't pay attention to externalities. That's the nature of a market system. So if you want to be in it, you play that game. On the side, you can be demonstrating against Keystone XL. I wouldn't be surprised if that's what you would discover, something like that. But it hasn't been studied, so I don't know.
Yeah, I was wondering, what would you say to young people who want to be politically active and politically aware, but are really discouraged by what kind of seems like every step we take forward, we're pushed 2 steps back?
One thing is to look at history. That's always been the case. At every point, whether it was abolitionism or civil rights, women's rights, anti-war activities, whatever it is, there's always a powerful force trying to beat it back. That's for obvious reasons. The power is concentrated and centralized, and it'll defend itself. So yes, you always have that. However, there's been a lot of progress. Just over, say, my lifetime, lots of progress in many dimensions, much more civilized country than it used to be. And that shows in many ways. And it's because people didn't give up. You got to recognize, that's the way it's going to be. The centers of power don't capitulate and say, fine, you take over. They're going to do what they can to maintain their power and authority. And populations can overcome it, and have repeatedly in the past.
Thank you very much for taking my question. About a year ago, the Renalzer Institute came out with a report called the 10% Tipping Point, showing that if you got 10% of the population to profoundly change their, I can't remember who his attitude, but something profound, that the rest would follow. What do you think of that? And what's your recommendation on rallying a revolt?
The 10% tipping point. There was a report released last year called the 10% tipping point. If you can get 10% of people to change their habits, you can tip.
I'm not giving an argument against people changing their habits. I think they should to the extent that we can, but I just don't believe it. I don't think that's the way things work. You can make a major change, and these are really major issues, if you have a really substantial part of the population dedicated and committed to doing something about it. What we do individually is, it's good, but it doesn't have that much of an effect. That's my opinion.
And then, how do we start a revolution?
Pardon?
How do we start a revolution?
How do we start a revolution? Well, we go out and say, power to the people,
Thank you.
Look, we have to be serious about it. A revolution that's going to be constructive, that'll lead things forward instead of going to some other kind of tyranny, can only take place when most of the population comes to understand that you can't achieve your goals through reform, that the system doesn't allow getting things that you really ought to have by using the methods within the system. And you take a look at history and see how that's been considered. Like take Karl Marx, for example. He was looking forward to a communist revolution, but he argued that in the more free societies, he was thinking about England, it could come about by parliamentary means, because there were measures that could be used if the population really got organized. And to some extent that begins to happen here and there, but other bigger powers knock it down. So Allende's Chile, for example, was taking parliamentary steps towards, not revolution, but very significant change. And you know what happened? We instituted a vicious dictatorship, and same in Guatemala, same elsewhere. But if big, powerful countries do it like us, or in Marx's view, England, which was at the time the major power, then you're protected from that. And in that case, if these means really do fail, and if the resistance is too great, the violence of those who want to protect their rights is too strong, then you can move into talking about revolution, but really not before that.
Thank you for coming. I've been reading your book since college. First book I read of yours was Language and Mind, and I still have it. I should have brought it for him to sign.
One of my favorites, too. It didn't convince anybody, but I still think it was right.
Hey, I loved it.
Good, that's two of us.
It's right on my bookshelf. You could solve an argument that I'm having with certain people about the virtue of Hezbollah and what your current thinking or opinion is of Hezbollah right now, and what do you think is the future for Hezbollah?
Well, right now they're in a difficult position. Within Lebanon, they're actually the core of the major political force. I mean, if you take a look at the last presidential election, 2010, there were two coalitions, March 8th, March 14th. The Hezbollah-based coalition actually got about 53% of the vote, about the same as Obama, but a minority of the seats. And the reason has to do with the confessional system that French occupation left behind it. There's a balance between the different groups, and the Shiites, who by now are a very large percentage, are underrepresented, and the more conservative elements are overrepresented. So it's a little bit like our House of Representatives. But they are the core of the major political coalition, and that remains true. They are also the only deterrent to an Israeli attack. The Lebanese army's not a deterrent. For one thing, it's probably permeated with Israeli spies and collaborators. But Hezbollah is a serious, organized force, and they liberated southern Lebanon. They drove the Israelis out after 22 years occupation, and during the last invasion, 2006, they held Israel off, which was a pretty serious blow to Israel. And their base, it's a complicated story. Their fundamental base is like a lot of the Islamic parties, social welfare. On the other hand, they have religious doctrines, which I certainly don't like, and I suspect you don't. They're tied to Iran in ways which I don't think are good for anybody. On the other hand, what other sport are they going to have? Now, right now, with Syria just undergoing something like suicide, it's unclear that the site will even survive. It's just being torn to shreds. They're losing the last source of external support, not from Syria, but from Iran through Syria. And that's pretty critical for them. That's why Israel was why they carried out that military attack a couple days ago, attacking military installations in Syria, which they said were not Syrian. They thought, maybe rightly, that those are weapons intended for Hezbollah, which would be a deterrent to an Israeli attack. Unfortunately, one of the major effects of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, all sorts of horrible effects, I mean, it's monstrous, but one effect was that it instigated Shiite-Sunni conflicts, which were not really present in Iraq before. There was a lot of intermarriage. People lived with each other, in the same neighborhoods. I mean, there's disagreements and conflicts like everywhere, but it wasn't much of a problem. But one of the consequences of the invasion was it inflamed it into a huge problem.
Right.
I mean, Iraq's being torn to shreds by this today. You take a look at every day's newspapers, 20 more people are killed in an attack on a mosque or something. That goes both ways. But that not only tore Iraq to shreds, it's spreading through the region. So the whole region is being rent by Shiite-Sunni conflicts, which it didn't have before. And that's a large part of what's going on in Syria. The Assad regime is run by a kind of an offshoot of Shiism, the Alawis, and the Sunnis are getting organized in protest. And they're all getting more radicalized. I mean, when you have a murderous civil war, everybody goes crazy. You killed my cousin, I'm going to kill your uncle. That's the dynamics. And it's all over the place. As long as the violence continues, it's going to continue like that. Actually, I'll tell you an anecdote. About 20 years ago, I was traveling in Ireland from Dublin to Belfast. This was right at the peak of the so-called Troubles, it was serious terror. I mean, the IRA was not a joke. It was practically blew up the British cabinet and all sorts of things. The British were violent and brutal, killing people all over the place. My wife and I went, we were taken by a woman who was a civil rights activist in Belfast, Catholic, she was on the Catholic side, but was trying to bring together the two sides. She's now in the Northern Ireland Parliament, and in fact, government. She's a minister, a wonderful person. Anyway, she drove us through areas that were right in the middle of the conflict. Like stopped at a farm where farmer's son had just been murdered by the British and things like that. But one place she took us to, which was quite interesting, was kind of a protected house where they'd brought in a guy, an IRA hitman, who had escaped from a British prison. And he was in this place with all kind of guards around and stuff like that. It was right in the middle of a war, literally. And I spent a couple hours talking to him, and basically one question: what do you think you're achieving? Suppose you kill somebody who's British or Protestant, and then he comes back and kills your friends and so on. What's the point? And he said just what I said before. I was actually quoting him. They killed my cousin. I'm going to kill their uncle. They're going to kill my brother. I'm going to kill their daughter. And that's what it is. There's nothing else.
Well, that's Jesus turning the other cheek.
This just becomes the psychology of civil conflict. Incidentally, this guy, a couple of years later, was on the negotiating team. I think he's now in the government. Things can change, but that's a dynamic that you see all the time in conflicts, and it's kind of understandable, horrible, but understandable. And that's why it's so important to work to try to dampen down the cycle of violence, so maybe something decent can come out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Professor Chomsky will sign books out the back.